Hello, I'm hosting this book club, Beau Dade, aka BB Dade, aka History Bro, joined by Josh Firm,
Hello.
aka Posh Josh,
I
aka
don't identify by that
the
label.
Firminator.
People used to call me that in
Really?
school, actually, yeah.
Oh, right. I thought I was being really original with that. Oh, well, okay. Damn. And we're going to talk about The Road to Wigan Pier by George Orwell today. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good to go. So you read it?
I didn't, well, I listened to it, actually. I listened
Right.
to the audiobook, but it's more or less the same thing, right?
Yeah. And I know you've read a fair bit of Orwell. You're familiar with Orwell's
Yeah,
oeuvre.
more or less. I haven't read every single one of his books and his journal articles. I think you've probably read more than I have, but I at least have a decent understanding of his writing and his beliefs, I would like to think, anyway.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, maybe we can go through this a bit and see what we can say about it. I mean, so it predates. Orwell only did 6 novels, 9 books in total, but only 6 novels. But loads of articles and essays and book reviews and loads of letters he wrote to his friends survive. So there's actually a very large body of work by Orwell, but only 6 true novels. I don't know if you'd even really count The Road to Wigan Pier. What do you think? It's not a novel, is it? It's not a story.
It's almost like a bit of an account or a report of some kind.
It's more like
because
journalism, isn't it?
Yeah, well, he's going out to other places and just describing what he sees, and it's not necessarily in a journalistic tone, at least by a modern standard, but he makes a strong kind of case at the end of the book as well, talking about the political implications, but he's mainly talking about the working conditions of people up north of England, really, isn't he?
Yeah. So it's a discussion on class, really, or all sorts of things, politics. So the first half of the book, roughly, is just him describing what it's like in the industrial north in the 30s, which is the Depression, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're in the middle of the Depression, really. And what it's like in places like Wigan. It's not just Wigan. He sort of travels all round, doesn't he? And then the second half, roughly, is like an extended essay sort of defending socialism to some degree.
Yeah, well,
What would you
he's
say?
trying to kind of keep his own side in check almost a little bit. He goes on and on about how other socialists aren't helping the cause and such, and it seems to me that he's gone out into these conditions and he's imposing his beliefs a little bit, but it doesn't detract from the observations being very valuable and interesting. Like I felt like I learnt a great deal about the conditions from what he described, although I think you said before this that you were somewhat sceptical about how much of it he was exaggerating just by his own disposition. So there's lots of descriptions of things that aren't very clean, as you can imagine, in very impoverished areas, and you suggested that he might be kind of a bit of a germaphobe or something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, he talks lots and lots about the terrible conditions and just how grubby it is, how dirty it is. And anyone that's read a fair bit of Orwell would realise that he talks about that quite a lot. I mean, in 1984, for example, immediately you're just confronted with the grubbiness, the dirtiness of things. I mean, it's supposed to be a post-apocalyptic world, so maybe it makes sense in 1984, but he talks about it a lot. I can't remember exactly where I read this or heard this, but I have heard some people say, contemporaries of his in the 30s and 40s, say it wasn't that bad. Like he's exaggerating it to some degree, but I don't know about that. I can't really comment on that. But his descriptions are, I mean, they're quite evocative, aren't they? Certainly things like going down the mines, like the industrial north, going in the collieries, going down the mines, and just how like the terrible back-breaking work and just the real dirtiness of everything.
Yeah, like his description of the mining was probably the thing that I got the most out of, because I had no idea that it was such a dangerous thing. Obviously, I knew it was dangerous being underground and mining and using things like dynamite and things like that is inherently dangerous, but just the extent to which it is also taxing on the body as well, where he talks about how they have to basically crawl for miles and miles every day, and by the time he even got to the point where they were mining, he was exhausted, and he had great admiration for these miners, supposedly, and he said as well that even though they were going through this arduous work, he really respected their character for it, because they didn't really complain about it. Sure, they were looking to improve their conditions, they weren't content necessarily, but they kind of took it on the chin and just got on with it. and the actual physical aspect of the job makes me think that it's almost inhuman that they were doing it in a sense that they were doing things that I don't think I could do, from Orwell's description anyway.
No, definitely. You sound like backbreaking, barely scratches the surface. Basically crawling, or at least stooped over almost double for a mile or more, 2-3 miles underground. And of course, all the coal dust. No mask on, no respiratory, nothing. You get black lung. People, they got black lung a lot. He actually physically went down there himself. I think just once, and it damn near killed him. I think he had to have a few days rest.
I think
afterwards.
he said, a week later he could still feel it on his legs or something like that.
But then when you get to the coal face, you're still sort of stooped over, and you've just got to hack away at the coal face. For hours and hours on end, and then go back. And he actually described one bit, I don't know if you remember it, that because you're stooped over loads, you end up sort of inevitably smashing your head or scraping your back along the roof.
Yeah, I remember that bit,
and that was just a common, really, really common ailment for miners to have that. I mean, on top of everything else, it's just horrible. And you get paid a pittance, barely enough to feed yourself and or your family.
Yeah.
Like really, really barely enough.
I think he was saying that you could see on the kind of indents on their spine, where you could see the bones in the spine, there would be a scab on each individual, like bump along it from kind of scraping it on the mine.
It's horrible,
roof.
isn't it?
It is, yeah.
It's really horrible.
It really paints a picture, because sure, I knew that mining isn't a pleasant business, but to that degree, it's something that really makes you realise that people's hardship back then is so much worse than now. Obviously, that's not a very profound point, but once you actually read about it, it makes it a bit more emotive in a way. And I certainly didn't realise the extent to which people would be willing to go through that suffering and, take it on the chin, be okay with it as well. And it is kind of credit to them. And I remember Orwell saying that the miners were perhaps the most welcoming to him, because of course he was going into people's houses asking them lots of questions, and obviously that's quite invasive and very strange, particularly for a working class family that might not understand what he's trying to do, writing a book about their lives. I mean, they'd probably think, well, what's so interesting about that? We do this day in, day out. Why would anyone want to know about it? And supposedly he didn't really get that from the miners. They're all very warm and friendly and welcomed him like a member of the family almost, he said.
Yeah.
So I thought that was very, very interesting observation that is very valuable. I think it's one of those things where talking about it secondhand, you're not really doing it justice, or at least I feel like I'm probably not.
Yeah, no, the descriptions of like the hovels the miners live in, really, just terrible. Obviously no modern amenities whatsoever. The houses are just falling down, or it's in sort of the very sort of wet north of England, where everything's damp at all times, and it's just the drudgery of it. I mean, you can see where the world of that appears in the novel 1984. You can sort of see where it comes from in a way, that you've seen the real thing to some extent. I suppose one thing I want to say is that George Orwell holds a very high place in literature, doesn't it? It's almost sort of sacrilege to criticise him or anything, but I'm going to go ahead and do that.
No, I think it's perfectly fair. I mean,
because he was a socialist. He was a Trotskyite. I mean, definitely, 100%. And though he criticised communism and Stalinism, which is amazing, he did it amazingly well. I mean, I don't want to run that down or anything, but this idea that he's sort of beyond reproach.
I mean, he's still a human being at the end of the day. I don't believe in just deifying someone because they've done some good things. I mean, everyone's got some kind of flaw.
Yeah, I mean, Christopher Hitchens wrote a book, Why Orwell Matters, and in it he said that Orwell was one of the main people that helped, quote, melt the permafrost of Stalinism. I mean, that alone is an amazing thing.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of
amazing.
overshadows all his otherwise socialist tendencies, I think. To give him the credit that is due, like that is way more important to society, than the negatives of him promoting socialism, despite the fact that we know that it doesn't really help people.
I just do think it's funny that liberals, classical liberals, even right-wingers will sort of, some anyway, hold him up as sort of this great shining example. But he was just a complete committed socialist. I mean, he wrote a lot of his articles for Tribune, a socialist rag. And when he went and fought in Spain, if people don't know, he actually went and fought the fascists in Spain. There's the book Homage to Catalonia. Which is just after he finished writing this, he went to Spain, so 1937, and fought for the communists. Well, fought for a Trotskyite faction. So yeah, he got shot in the throat actually.
Yeah, that's pretty brutal.
Yeah.
Like, I think he went home after that, didn't he? I mean, it's
basically,
unsurprising. Yeah.
Well, he was nearly going to get killed by the other communists in Spain. Just quickly on that, he fought for one of the many factions. There was everything from sort of Catalan nationalists to anarchists to all different stripes of communists all fought together against Franco. And his particular faction, the Trotskyite faction, in the end, or relatively quickly I suppose, became the enemy of the Stalinists, the Spanish Stalinists. Because, again, if anyone doesn't know, the Stalinists and Trotskyists are bitter enemies.
Well, yeah, I mean,
you know,
Stalin got Trotsky killed. I mean, he hired someone to put an ice pick in his head when he was hiding in Mexico. So he wasn't even a threat to the USSR at the time, I don't think. Well, he might have been marginal just by existing, but I think he'd pretty much retired from politics, and he was so bitter about his existence that he couldn't allow him to live, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, no, that's exactly right. I think Stalin couldn't abide that his enemies were still out there in the world, still breathing.
Yeah.
Christopher Hitchens says this. He says, "I sometimes feel as if George Orwell requires extricating from a pile of saccharin tablets and moist hankies, an object and sickly veneration and sentimental overpraise employed to stultify school children with his insufferable rightness and purity."
I think that's a fair statement by my view.
Yeah. Although I think his works are superb reads.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. I think Down and Out in Paris in London, his first true novel, is a brilliant page-turner. 1984, Animal Farm, they're both great. Well, The Road to Wigan Pier is good, but is it's just not like this saint. Because Robert Conquest, the famous historian stroke poet, called him a moral genius.
Well, I think that's a bit strong, isn't it?
I don't think you could call a trot a moral genius. I just don't think you can. And that's my opinion.
I don't think that's particularly controversial.
All right.
I mean, at best, you can perhaps call him a bit naive. At worst, you could say he's deliberately ignoring the things that he saw in Road to Wigan Pier with his own eyes. And, I mean, he was supposedly getting a measure of people's political views as well and whether they wanted change. And I think he could see that there wasn't a particular appetite for socialism amongst the working class that he was talking to. So there's a certain amount of kind of elitism where he from a middle class perspective, going in to the working class and thinking he knows better for them, sort of thing. That that's relatively questionable, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he described himself as lower upper middle class, like kind of tongue in cheek, but very deliberately described himself that way. Because people don't know his early life. He went to Eton. His family was sort of very minor colonial officials, his father was, and he went to Eton, but he didn't go on to Oxbridge or anything. He never had any money particularly. Died of a disease which is usual among working class people, among people that had to live through poverty their whole life. Consumption, or TB, tuberculosis.
Okay, yeah.
Consumption is just a very old-fashioned word for it. There's Professor Lionel Trilling wrote this about Orwell. He said, if we ask what it is he stands for, what he is a figure of, the answer is the virtue of not being a genius, of fronting the world with nothing more than one's simple, direct, undeceived intelligence and respect for the power one does have and the work one undertakes to do it. He is not a genius. What a relief! What an encouragement! For he communicates to us the sense that what he has done, any one of us could do.
I don't think that's necessarily very unreasonable. He's certainly not a genius, but he doesn't necessarily, like the language that he uses, he doesn't put himself on a pedestal as someone who's going to see things that others might not. He says, if you come down and look at this, then you will see for yourself. He says things like that repeatedly throughout the book. And you kind of get the impression that he's not trying to put himself across as some kind of figure who knows more than the average person, maybe, although it's somewhat implicit in there.
I mean, his writing, his prose is quite relatively simple, isn't it? Quite prosaic. I mean, anyone can pick up 1984 and just read it. You don't have to have done a degree in politics or sociology or anything.
Well, yeah, there's
really.
a reason that people read it in school, is because it's nice and easy to read.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.